In this episode, I'm speaking with Bruce Feiler. Bruce is the author of 7 New York Times bestsellers, including Life is in the Transitions, The Secrets of Happy Families, and The Council of Dads. We are discussing in this episode his latest book, The Search: Finding Meaningful Work in a Post-Career World. As you'll hear me say during our discussion, this is the most actionable book on this topic I have read, and I have had a lot of authors of books on this topic on this podcast. Cue the music.
Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast, brought to you by Career Pivot. This podcast is where those of us in the second half of life come together to discuss how to repurpose our careers for the 21st century. Come listen to career experts give you proven strategies. Listen to people like you tell their stories on how they repurpose their careers. And finally, get your questions answered. Your host, Mark Miller, has made 6 career pivots over the last 30 years. He understands this is not about jumping out of the frying pan into a fire, but rather to create a plan where you make clear, actionable steps or pivots to a better future career. Are you ready to repurpose your career?
Welcome to episode 326 of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. My name is Mark Miller, and I'll be your host every Monday for a discussion on what it's like to repurpose your career. In this episode, I'm speaking with Bruce Feiler. Bruce is the author of 7 New York Times bestsellers, including Life is in the Transitions, The Secrets of Happy Families, and The Council of Dads. We are discussing in this episode his latest book, The Search: Finding Meaningful Work in a Post-Career World. As you'll hear me say during our discussion, this is the most actionable book on this topic I have read, and I have had a lot of authors of books on this topic on this podcast. Here is a bit of Bruce's bio from his website, brucefeiler.com. Bruce Feiler is one of America's most thoughtful voices on contemporary life. He is the author of New York Times bestsellers, including Life is in the Transitions, The Secrets of Happy Families, and Council of Dads. His 3 TED Talks have been viewed more than 4 million times, and he teaches the TED course How to Master Life Transitions. His latest book, The Search: Finding Meaningful Work in a Post-Career World, is a bold new roadmap for finding meaning and purpose at work, based on insights drawn from hundreds of life stories of all vocations and backgrounds. Employing a first-hand approach to his work, Bruce is known for the living experiences he writes about. His work combines timeless wisdom with timely knowledge to encourage people to live with more meaning, passion, and joy. Life is in the Transition describes his journey across America, collecting hundreds of life stories, exploring how we can navigate life's growing number of life transitions with purpose and skill. One of those books that's so profoundly aligned with the zeitgeist that ended up underlying the whole book, Arianna Huffington wrote in Thrive Global. Bruce Feiler is the perfect person to lead us on this journey. The book was top 10 New York Times bestseller. For 2 decades, Bruce has explored the intersection of family, relationship, health, and happiness. His book, The Secrets of Happy Families, collects best practices for some of the country's most creative minds. The book was featured on World News, GMA, and Today, and excerpted on the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and Parade. The Council of Dads described how, faced with one of life's greatest challenges, he asked 6 friends to support his young daughters. The book was profiled in People, USA Today, and Time, and became a CNN documentary hosted by Dr. Sanjay Gupta and an NBC drama series. The longtime journalist at the New York Times, Bruce now writes the popular newsletter, The Non-Linear Life. He has appeared in numerous publications, including The New Yorker, The Wall Street Journal, Harvard Business Review, and Gourmet, where he won 3 James Beard Awards. He is a frequent commentator on radio and television, a former circus clown, and he has been the subject of a Jay Leno joke and a Jeopardy question. His face appears on the postage stamp in the Grenadines. A native of Savannah, Georgia, Bruce lives in Brooklyn with his wife, Linda Ruttenberg, and their identical twin daughters. This episode is sponsored by the Career Pivot community, but more on that later. Without any delay, let's get to my discussion with Bruce Feiler. Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast. I have the real joy of having Bruce Feiler on the podcast, whose book is The Search, Finding Meaningful Work in a Post-Career World. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Mark. And you just spent the entire pre-show conversation that we had talking about your incredible nonlinear work life and saying these incredibly generous things about the search. Can we just carry that from the
Sure.
from the green room into whatever we are here, the real room that we're in?
Well,
every bit of that was precious.
Well, I was telling Bruce, I've interviewed a ton of people on this podcast, including Joanne Lippman, who wrote The Next, Bruce Carlgard, publisher of Forbes. I've had Michael Clinton, who wrote the book Roar, which was also very, very good. But this is the most actionable book I have found. As I was reading it, I'm starting to tick off boxes and looking at things. And it's something that I probably will reread. And I'm thinking of it with my own online community as starting a book club event around this and read it together.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Start out with, number one, why did you write the book? And you have this whole work story project that I think was quite fascinating. Can you tell us about that?
By way of introduction, I did not start out with the nonlinear life that has become my life's work. In a lot of ways, I had what I now think of as a classic linear life. Like I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, right? I went to Yale. I moved to Japan. I started writing letters home on crinkly airmail paper. And it's nice to be with someone who is, my generation, for whom that is not a strange, the kids these days, they don't know from crinkly airmail paper, right? But when I got back to Georgia back in the 80s, writing these letters home from Japan, everyone said, "I love your letters." And I was like, "Great. Have we met?" And it turned out that my grandmother had Xeroxed them and passed them around, and they went viral in a sort of OG 1980s sense of the word. And this started me in this life of writing. And I wrote books about Japan and England and country music. I spent a decade, as you know, traveling back and forth to the Middle East, writing books and making television. And this was the fantasy linear life. Like I figured out what I wanted to do early. I did it for no money. I had some success. I got married and had children. And then my life just blew up in my 40s. First, I got cancer as a new dad of identical twin daughters. I had financial troubles. My dad got very depressed from Parkinson's and tried to take his own life 6 times in 12 weeks. And I'm a storyteller, and I didn't know how to tell my story, and I was sort of ashamed to do it. But when I managed to, everyone I talked to had a similar moment or series of moments when their life got blown up too. And so I called my wife one night. I was actually at a college reunion, and I said, "No one knows how to tell their story anymore, and I want to do something to help." And that led to what has now become this life's work of traveling around the U.S., collecting hundreds of life stories of Americans of all ages, all walks of life, all backgrounds. Like a typical academic paper in this space will have 8, 10, 12 of these life stories. I've done 400 now in the span of 6 years. And that led to my first book in this space called Life is in the Transitions, that came out in the middle of the pandemic when the entire planet was in a life transition. So I sort of it turns out I've been working on this project for, 3 years at that point, but I suddenly had the right book at the right time. That led to a TED talk and a TED course, et cetera. And in that moment in time, it just became, I felt it, but then I also saw it around me, like work was going to be the next domino to fall. And, a series of things then happened, as I was working on this book: the Great Resignation, right? Quiet quitting. We know that 5 million people, 50 plus, left the workforce and sort of never came back. And you had the pandemic and the, social justice movement. All of these changes happened at once. And so as I was gathering and analyzing these stories, all of this was building, so that the moment that we're in right now is 70% of Americans are unhappy with what they do. 3/4 of Americans say they plan to look for new work this year. That means 100 million Americans will sit down with someone they love this year and say, honey, I'm not happy with what I'm doing. I want to do work that makes me happy. And that's the gap where you mentioned the actionable nature of the search. The gap is, okay, I'm not bound to these old scripts, and we can get into that. What's a career? What's a path? What's a ladder? All these old things have gone away. So the old rules are no longer in existing, but the new rules haven't been written. And so a lot of what I've tried to do here is give someone, okay, I want to be happy, but no one's taught me how to think about being happy. So here's how to set about trying to figure out what it is that would bring you meaning and happiness.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that came across to me is I was programmed by my parents.
Great. I love that word. That is such a great word.
My parents were very old when I was born in the mid-1950s. My mom was born in 1918. My dad was 1920.
Wow.
My dad was served in World War II, and I was supposed to go work for a big company, which I did. I went to work for IBM until they screwed me. And I was supposed to write
and saved your life at the same time.
Yes, and I went off, and I was supposed to do that for 35 or 40 years and ride off in the sunset with a pension and retire. And they moved my cheese. For me, that was a good thing.
Turned out to be a good thing.
Yes. But for many people, making that transition, or where the story changes or the rules change. And what I liked, you talk about the American success story, the old Dale Carnegie and all that. And it's like, hate to say this, but that's all bullshit now.
Yeah. It's very interesting that you say this, and I just love the word programmed. I'm suddenly envious of that word, because I think that programming is exactly what it was. We were all programmed, right? Since the dawn of America, right? Since Ben Franklin, the story that we've been telling in this country is all about climbing, right? Up by your bootstraps, rags to riches, higher office, bigger, higher floor, bigger office, greater salary, more benefits. That's not the route to happiness. And it turns out, and this is what's interesting, right? So you mentioned that story. One of the things that I did at the outset of this is I gathered the 5 most prominent success books of the last century. That would be How to Win Friends and Influence People, The Power of Positive Thinking, What Color is Your Parachute, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And when you turn the pages of those books, as I did at the desk where I'm talking to you today from in Brooklyn, 93% of the people in those books are straight white men. If you look at the workforce of today, it's half the workforce is, millennials and Gen Z, right? It's majority female and increasingly diverse. And so what's interesting about this, right, for your community, right, is that in a lot of ways, we it's sort of like the get off my lawn, like the millennials ruined work, right? Well, no, the millennials saved work. And what's happened is it's boomeranged back and given people of our generation, 50 plus, permission, right? Because what the younger workers are doing is they're not prepared to buy into the narrative that work is supposed to be miserable. Okay. And you are supposed to do what you are expected to do. That's how we were programmed. Okay. This idea of a career, it's a myth. It was invented in 1908 by a guy named Frank Parsons in Boston. And the idea was, once in your life, in your 20s, by the way, if you were a man, and only if you were a man, you pick a career, an occupation, and you do it for the next 50 years. That was an accident of history, because a third of workers left farms, came from overseas, and they were suddenly in cities and they had nothing to do. And the entire way that we've talked about work since has been about in linear constructs. So the career ladder, right? The career track. Even the idea of a resume was invented in the 1950s, more or less around the time that you were born. And that was a series of successive jobs, each one bigger and more splashier than the last. Well, by the way, what does that do? That stigmatizes spending time with family, performing military service, starting an organization, doing public service for a while, changing your mind, right? Something as simple as that. And that's where we are now. The nonlinear life has become the norm. We lack a language for it, right? Which is why the sort of the heart of this book is talking about what I call work quakes, right? You just talked about a work quake, right? Your employer, your lifetime employer, moved your cheese, said, we don't need you anymore, or we're downsizing or outsourcing or whatever it might be. Okay. So the average person will have one of these moments. I call them work quakes, right? Because some are voluntary, some are involuntary. But we go through 20 in our lives. Every 2.5 years, it's like this jolt or this disruption where you rethink or reimagine what you're doing. And here, I think, is the signature piece of data. And I think what I've learned about your life in this conversation and what we were talking about before we came on the air, if I can use that old-fashioned language, is 45% of them begin in the workplace. Conflict with your boss, the company shuts down. Okay, you get laid off. But that means the majority of them, 55%, begin outside the workplace. You've had some of those too, right? You told me about a medical event, right? I had cancer at 43, right? A medical event, a family event, right? Your mom gets chemo and you want to take her to the, to the doctor's appointment or whatever it is. And so that's what's going on in the battle between work and life. Life is playing a bigger role because there's no career track anymore. There's no penalty for getting off of it. And then we have these oscillating lives with these work quakes, each one being a moment to rethink and reimagine what it is that you want to do.
This episode is sponsored by the Career Pivot membership community. The Career Pivot membership community is a group of people from all over the U.S. and Canada with diverse backgrounds. This is a community where everyone is there to help everyone else out figure out what they want to do in the second half of life and then make it happen. Many have made changes that they did not know existed or was possible when they came to the community. They learn from each other and broaden their horizons on what was really possible. Let's hear what Vicky had to say about being part of the community.
For me, I would say it's the resources that you've made available to the community, whether it's bringing on speakers who have insights into the current hiring and job searching trends, especially during the pandemic. This has been so useful. Highlighting companies that are providing remote work for older adults. And again, this is how I was able to get my current part-time job, but also helping me to see new possibilities about what work might look like now and in the immediate future, because, this is so important. The traditional jobs that our generation was raised with have essentially evaporated. And so that's really what's been most helpful to me most recently.
You can't just join the community. I bring people into the community every few months in groups. You can sign up for the waiting list, so when I open the door for new members, you'll be notified. If you're interested in learning more about the endeavor and sign up for the waiting list, please go to careerpivot.com/community. Now, back to the episode. Yeah, one of the things I'm doing right now is I'm working on a mental health series for 50 plus for my blog. And I asked for an outline from ChatGPT.
Oh, interesting.
And one of the things it did was says, okay, and when you hit your 50s, there are lots of transitions.
Yep.
Kids leaving home, taking care of parents, maybe your spouse getting sick. Maybe you go retirement. Maybe you get laid off. There are all these transitions, and all these transitions, if you can control them, as I did when IBM screwed me in my pension, I went bye-bye, and I moved on my terms. But very often that doesn't happen, and we're not prepared for it. So that's why I find it interesting, the work quakes of it's more than just what happens at work. It's kids leaving the house.
Some of them are joyful, like you said. I mean, I mentioned earlier, I'm the parent of identical twin daughters. Okay, when they were born, it was a life quake and a work quake, right? It was joyful, but it changed everything about our lives. And by the way, they graduated from high school a week ago. As we have this conversation, we're dropping them off for college 60 days. Literally, I'm looking at the calendar. 60 days from today. That's going to be a work quake too, and a life quake, right? And so the general frame of this exercise, so to speak, of what I've been doing, and of the last two books, both Life is in the Transitions and The Search, is to destigmatize and normalize these periods, right? So we go through what I was calling life quake. We go to 3 to 5 life quakes in the course of our lives. Their average length is 5 years. So you do the math, 3 to 5, 4, 5, 6 years. That's 25 years. That's half of our adult lives we spend in transition. And the way we've been talking about it in this culture is grit and grind and resilience your way through them. If you are looking at them as the aberration, as the unnormal, then you're missing it. We have to look at this time as the normal. And as it's painful, it's challenging. The life transition, in effect, is the response to the life quake. But we have to look at these periods as also periods of growth and renewal, and especially as periods where we can take agency, we can take control, we can put our hands on the wheel and say, I'm not just going to be the passive recipient of this, I'm going to be an active participant in adding a new chapter to my life story, rethinking who I want to be. That's why the bulk of the search is, when you're in a work quake, ask these questions. When you don't know what to do this. And it is an exercise to put you through, okay, this has happened either because I've initiated it or I am the recipient of it. Now I'm going to play an active role in saying, how do I want to respond? Because if you just go jump to the new job or jump to the next hoop, you're going to be unhappy and back where you were 2 years later.
Well, one of the things that I found, I said, I'm 67. When I started my career, I became an actor. I played roles, and I kept on playing those roles.
Oh, you're using actor like in the lowercase a sense of the word. Like you were acting, and my way of saying this is that you were trying to be the hero of someone else's story, not the hero of your own story.
I mean, I became a geek that could speak.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
And which I got really good at.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, by the time I hit my 50s, it left me exhausted because I'm a big time introvert.
Interesting.
I'm a recovery engineer. Yeah, there's a 12-step program for that. I suddenly went
12.35 or whatever an engineer would do. 12 would be too simple.
But number one, I couldn't. I became something that I wasn't. I was good at it.
Yeah.
I got paid a lot of money for it.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm going, this is not me.
So here's my way of saying this. I appreciate your, being honest about that, because the way I think about it now is we get on what I call the should train. I should be doing this. Like, now I'm going to use my Southern accent. I should be doing that, right? My parents told me I needed to be doing this. My culture, emphasized that I should be doing that. I want those external, metrics of success and achievement, but I'm not happy. And now what do you do, right? So the way I guess the way I would try to capture it is, we have linear expectations that we were programmed for, right? So we have linear expectations, but nonlinear lives. And it's the tension between those two things that creates a lot of the anxiety, okay? So what is the solution? Okay, so the backbone of the search is these hundreds of stories I've talked to people who are happy, who have made, the telephone operator who became the woman's shoe designer, right? The bank manager who opened the painting company that his parents told him he couldn't open when he was 22. On and on and on, these kinds of stories of people who are happy. And I would say that the big takeaway is the people who are happiest and most fulfilled in what they do, they don't just climb, they also dig. They do what I call a meaning audit, where when they are in a work quake, they ask themselves a series of questions to determine who I am and what I want to do. So let's just take a couple of the questions. So the first question is like, what were the upsides and downsides of work you learned from your parents? I love that you began this conversation by saying that you were, sort of shaped by your parents, but we don't talk about that. I mean, you cannot find this in the literature about work, but yet this is the big question. So when I ask people, for example, what's the number one upside you learned about work from your parents? The most common answer was the value of hard work. It certainly wasn't the case with me. We want to work hard. Like we did. This is sort of the backbone of who we are. And frankly, just as a questioner, as you're a questioner now, that you've come to the dark side of talking to people and interviewing them and talking, you left the numbers behind, and now you're a word person. Like now you're coming to my side of the aisle here. I didn't I frankly found these answers boring. And I was like, something is wrong with the question I'm asking, right? The only metric for a question is the quality of the answer. And I was asking people the upsides, and 2/3 of the people were telling me the same thing. So then I started asking what I hadn't intended to ask, which is, so what's the number one downside you learned from your parents? And this is when it became interesting, because the number one downside, overwork, followed by strain on the family, followed by unhappiness. They were all clumped around a third each. Now, let's put these next to each other. 2/3 of people say that they learned the value of hard work and they want to work hard. But what are they not prepared based on what they saw their parents do? They're not prepared to overwork. They're not prepared to put a strain on their family. They're not prepared to be unhappy. In that one, we're only one question into what I call 21 questions to find work you love, this actionable plan you were kind enough to mention. And already we have identified this shaping of our work story that is not, we're too focused on, polish up your resume, call your, that's how we talk about this. And it's so boring and we got the point. But the real answer is not outside, it's inside.
Yeah, I find these questions, the one that really hit me was, who shaped my life or who shaped my career? And I go back to, because I became a geek that could speak around the late 80s, early 90s. And my parents didn't train me to have mentors.
Yeah, interesting.
Work did not. And suddenly there were several people who suddenly went, wow, that's why I am the I am today. They had great influence on me.
Oh, they're waymakers. Oh, that's so interesting.
Right.
So people that were colleagues or friends or people
colleagues.
Remote, yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so it's one of these deals of, they're not people who I'm purposely selected, but they influenced me.
Yeah. So this is part of what we're after here, and part of writing a work story. This is a very simple question. It's very powerful. The who in the who, what, when, where, why. The who in my life, right? The person or people in my life right now who are most important to my work decisions are blank. Okay. Now this is interesting, right? Because some people may be younger than you and I. And the many people listen to this, for that, it may be my children, right? Like I want to be at a moment in my life where I'm going to spend time with my children, and I won't necessarily take that promotion, or I definitely won't take a job that requires me to travel 2 weeks a month, but it's nonlinear. It's not forever, right? I mean, if you think about all the women out there who were told all through the 20th century, if you get off the escalator, right? If you spend time with your children, you'll never get back on. I mean, what has squandered more human potential? What a waste to tell people you have to make a decision when your child is 6 months old that's going to shape your work life 20 years later. That is cruel and unnecessary and ridiculous, frankly. Okay, so it might be children. It might be, your mother has chemo and you want to go to the appointments, right? But it also might be, who's that person that you're looking at out there who does what you do but has a podcast on the side, right? Who's that person who is writing a screenplay, or, maybe someone that's selling pickles at the farmer's market, right? Or maybe moves to Mexico and, and takes up painting birdhouses because they want quality of life. What's going on now is that meaning has come to the heart of the conversation. So people are rejecting the idea that you're supposed to be miserable. And we have this new set of benchmarks that I call meaning, but we could call it happiness, we could call it balance, we could call it flexibility. Meaning has arrived at the heart. That is why this is the biggest change of work in a century. Because when you went to work at IBM in the 70s, no one was talking to you about meaning. They were talking to you about, work for the blue chip company, get the gold ring, get the gold watch, have the prestige and the status. These are all external things. Part of how you were being programmed while you were programming, whatever you were programming at the company. And what we're doing now is we're not saying follow this pre-existing script, follow your own script, make yourself the hero of your story. And here is what I'm saying, and the search is a series of questions that will help bring you closer to that.
It's interesting. One of the things when I was doing one-on-one coaching, I used something called the Berkman assessment to pick your personality apart, but more importantly, to go back and look back at your career and when have you been the happiest?
Yeah, nice.
And when have you been the most miserable?
Yeah.
And why?
Yeah. I love that.
I claim you've got 30 plus years of big data.
Yeah, that's nice.
Right.
Yeah. You've got big data in your brain that no one's accessing. And that's interesting because now, of course, the idea of mining big data is de rigueur. Like that's sort of what we all are trying to do. But we don't mine the data inside our own life story. There's this interesting field, right? I mean, I learned about a lot of this because I was actually working on a book called Secrets of Happy Families 10 years ago. And I came up with this research that the children who know more about their life story are better able to navigate their life's ups and downs, right? And 6 months later is when my dad, in his 70s with Parkinson's, tried to take his own life 6 times in 12 weeks. And we tried lots of things, medication, therapy, et cetera. But the thing that was most effective is when I started sending my dad a question every Monday morning about his life. Tell me about the toys you played with as a kid. Tell me about the house you grew up in. How'd you become an Eagle Scout? How'd you join the Navy? How'd you meet mom? And that's what brought him back to life. And when I wrote about this in Life is in the Transitions and give a TED talk about this, in fact, now if you go to my website, brucefeiler.com, I have a way I can email you a question every Monday morning to think back on your life. I learned about this whole field called narrative gerontology, which is, as you get older, reprocessing your life story, looking for themes, looking for patterns that will help you. So if you want to know, one of the things they say when you have children, if you say to your child before a test or grandchild, before a test or a big sporting event or a big ballet recital, you've done this in the past, remind them that they've gotten through it. It will give them confidence to do it again. And it's the same thing. If you go back and mine your life, looking at the transitions, looking at how the lessons, exactly as you've been doing here. I lost my job and my pension. I walked away. I did this. Then I had a medical thing. And I did. If you go back and look at these things, you will identify themes and patterns. I mean, I'll just give you one quick data point from the search, which I love. And I know you just finished it. So you just encountered this because it's near the end. When I ask people, did you get a piece of advice that helped you? And if so, who was it from? Answer, by the way, colleagues and friends, not family, which is interesting. What was that advice? 3/4 of people said that the advice was trust yourself. People don't want a kick in the butt. They want a pat on the back because you have the answer. The big data inside you has already generated the answer. You just have to give yourself permission to listen to the answer that is already whispering in your own ear.
Yeah, it's learning to trust yourself.
Nice.
And believe in yourself. And more importantly, be kind to yourself. In fact, we've had a discussion in more of my mastermind groups about the fact that the stories we tell ourselves, the questions we ask ourselves are sometimes nastier than we'd ever talk to anybody else. So why can't we talk to ourselves the way we talk to other people?
It's interesting. You're talking about mastermind, and lots of people have these kinds of groups, and it's incredibly valuable. I got a call a few years ago from a guy. I had made a TV series with a big flashy network and had some challenges. And so a friend of mine called and said, "Hey, I got a friend who's in this similar situation." So this guy calls me. He's actually from London. And we have this, I told him what I did. It took me about 10 minutes. Then he told me what he was going through. It took him about 25 minutes. And at the end, he's like, "That was a great conversation. Thank you." And I said, "Well, I don't think I said anything that was helpful." And he said, "Oh, my granny had a saying, a problem shared is a problem halved." And I love this, right? So the act of sharing itself is very valuable. But then, and that sort of talked about a little bit in Life is the Transition. So in this book, I sort of started digging in, like, what is the advice? And I think a lot of it is permission giving, right? And I think that, so what is permission giving? What permission giving is the opposite of being programmed, right? So being programmed is getting on the should train, and permission giving is getting on the want train, right? This is what I want. And, one of the questions that comes up a lot, and, when you talk about life transitions with people is, how do you make the leap? Should you stay or should you go, right? By the way, there's lots of things people do to have, to kind of have their cake and eat it too. They give themselves a buffer, like, okay, I'll give myself a year to test it, right? Or they start a side job, or what I call a hope job, something on the side that they can experiment, that maybe that screenplay or selling those pickles at the farmer's market, will become a source of revenue and more time of your life. But the biggest single thing that I kept hearing over and over again was the pain of staying was greater than the pain of leaving. So the fear I had from taking the leap was greater than the fear I had, which I knew if I don't take the leap, I'm going to wither and shrink, and I'm just going to become a person or a figure that I don't want to be. So there's a simple question. Is the pain of staying greater, or is the pain of leaving greater? Ask yourself that question, and it'll guide you to the right decision.
Yeah, your two of your questions I really liked is, where is your where?
Yeah.
And why is your why? And the interesting one with where's your where is I just recently did a men's group with an organization out of New York City and it turned out to be many men retirees. And one of the things we talked about was place.
Yeah, so good.
And one of the things they said was their favorite place turns out is the place that they could be the most calm.
Interesting.
And it was almost like, it put them in a meditative state. It could be one gentleman was sitting by the dock in Florida, sipping on a margarita or whatever, and just the sound of the ocean coming in. The other person was in Central Park listening to the birds in New York City. And so it's like, wow.
Yeah, I think a lot of this, I wrote a book called Council of Dads because when my kids got, when I got cancer, when my kids were 3 and it looked like I was going to die 15 years ago, actually next week, as I look at the calendar here, I asked a group of men to be present in the lives of my daughters. And I wrote a memoir about this, and it became a series on NBC, et cetera. One of the things I learned for men in particular, I would say, there's a kind of, and men of a certain age, I would say, there's a kind of performative aspect of being a man who was born at that time, during those decades, right? You're supposed to be the problem solver. You're supposed to be Mr. Fix-It. You're supposed to be the strong, silent one. I grew up in the South where that kind of certain kind of masculinity was certainly present. And I think younger men are less constricted by that, but older men are. And so when you said, they wanted to be in a place with calm, what I heard was they wanted to be in a place where they didn't have to perform the expectations that are often shouldered, or that they feel are shouldered on them by the kind of the more restrictive nature of being a man than younger generations are embracing. And so but the place thing is very interesting, right? Because place is sort of the thing that we leave out of our work stories a lot of time. But I think in a post-pandemic world, it's the thing that the pandemic, I would say, most changed, right? Because think of all the people who relocated, right? Okay, so how many? If you are still working, in a kind of a white collar job, you now don't necessarily need to be in the office, right? So there's this massive tug of war going on between organizations and their 2 days a week, 3 days a week, 4 days a week, 5 days a week, that's not coming back. But 4 days, 3 days, that's a place, right? And so there was the big story in the Wall Street Journal even a week ago as we taped this conversation was, a company that said, okay, you can work from anywhere. People sold their houses, they sold their cars, they moved to cheaper thing, they didn't have to commute. And then 6 months later, the boss changed his mind and they're like, screw you. Because the other thing that's going on that we haven't talked about in this conversation is that 50 million people quit a job in the last year. That's a third of the workforce. And because when there's no career, there's no more penalty for getting off the career. So place is it's up for grabs right now. And so asking yourselves this here, what places were you drawn to as a child, right? What places do you want to be in now? I want to be in a place that this will help you get closer to this part of the story that we often leave out.
Bruce, this has been really good. If when someone puts your book down, what do you want them to do?
The answer is I want them to feel empowered to take control of their story. The idea that your life is a story has been building for a couple of decades now in contemporary life. It began in the fringes of psychology in the 80s, and it's sort of become, but for whatever reason, we've left it out of work. And I think that that's a very sad thing. So what I want people to do is let the should train leave the station, go find a way to get on the want train. But before you get on that want train, try to identify where you want that train to go today, not where you would have wanted it to go 20 years ago, or even where you might want it to go 10 years from now. The purpose of these 21 questions to find work you love is to identify what is the work you want right now. And I think particularly for people 50 plus who, are still haunted by the ghost of linearity and the ghost of the career and the ghost of their parents' expectations and their society's expectations and their company's expectations. Try to identify, I'm in a moment in my life when I want to do work that my purpose right now is. So oddly, what I want you to do is to go to that quiet space and to say, think of the dark room that Aaron Rodgers went in, right? Go to your own dark room and ask yourself, what do I want now? And try as much as possible not to listen to the other people. Try to listen to yourself. If there's one thing I've learned, we all deserve to be the hero of our own story. So take control. Utter the most powerful words in some ways that the human language knows. Once upon a time, I'm going to start a new story right now.
Yeah, I'll leave you with this thought. One of the challenges a lot of people have is when they say, you know what, I'm not happy what I'm doing. And everyone would go, oh, but you're so good at it. You make so much money at it. Yeah. Why would you want to stop? You say, well, by the way, it sucks. And it's surrounding yourself with people who will go, okay,
yes, nice.
Why, who, what do you really want to do? And be supportive. And it's supportive to be the new you, not the person you were.
And that's why I think, I mentioned this earlier in passing, that when you ask people, as I did, who gave you the best advice, it wasn't family, because in some ways the family, it could be that we just downplay them, but I actually think it's that they're too close to it. They have too much at stake. If it's your parents, what they wanted you to believe, it's your immediate family. It might be okay. They enjoy the trappings of your job, and it may be the money. I mean, there's a reason that in a Harvard study, 9 out of 10 people said they would give up a quarter of their lifetime earnings for work they found more meaningful. The meaning is not going away. We are in the meaning moment. Any organization has to meet the meaning needs of its talent, or they're going to leave. And anybody who is the talent has to say, what is it that gives me meaning right now? And what are things that I can do right now to bring me closer to being the hero of my own story?
Well, Bruce, this has been great.
Thank you so much.
If someone wanted to reach out and contact you, and more importantly, buy your book, how might they do that?
So I'm Bruce Feiler. It's Feiler. I'm on all social channels at Bruce Feiler, and I have brucefeiler.com. I write a weekly newsletter on these themes called The Nonlinear Life at brucefeiler.substack.com. Life is in the Transitions is out in paperback, and The Search, Finding Meaningful Work in a Post-Career World, is out now in hardcover. And I hope it will bring some meaning into your life, and I hope it will start a meaningful conversation with those that you love.
We will put all of that in the show notes. And with that, Bruce, thank you very much for being on the Repurpose Your Career podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and stay safe.
I have spoken with a lot of authors, and I will say Bruce is a real pro and a really nice guy. If you are struggling with a direction in your life and career, the 21 questions that Bruce poses in his book are good tools to get clarity. I found myself working on answering those questions as I read the book. Take a moment, go to careerpivot.com, sign up for the weekly Career Pivot Insights newsletter, which is sent out every Sunday. You'll get a weekly update on this podcast, white papers, and new blog posts. When you subscribe, you'll receive my latest white paper, Ageism, the Last Acceptable Bias. While there, do not forget to check out the Career Pivot community, which can be found at careerpivot.com/community. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Look for Career Pivot on LinkedIn. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. You will find all the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-326. You can subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Podbeam, Overcast, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, and lots of other places where podcasts can be found. In fact, this podcast can be found on the Repurpose Your Career podcast channel on YouTube. Hope to see you next Monday for another episode of Repurpose Your Career podcast.